Hello everyone, my name is Langen and the following presentation is on the Aborigines people of Australia and the current issues Aborigines face within the criminal justice system. My presentation will consist of a summary and background of the Aborigines history, a discussion on the overrepresentation of Indigenous Australians in the criminal justice system and the results of such, the similarities between Aboriginal Canadians and Australians, and then I'll end my presentation with a conclusion. The lives of Indigenous Australians today are affected by what has happened to them and their ancestors over the past 200 years since the Europeans arrived. To best describe the Aborigines' history, I've created a timeline. 600 years ago, early contact. The outside world started to make contact with some Aboriginal groups. European sailors made contact. Some of it was positive for Aboriginal people, including sharing technologies. Other aspects of this early contact had a negative impact, in particular, the introduction of diseases. 1768, colonization. In 1768, the arrival of Lieutenant James Cook and then Arthur Phillip marked the beginning of the white settlement. 1788, the first fleet arrives. The first fleet arrives and builds a settlement at Port Jackson in Sydney, New South Wales, the beginning of a permanent European settlement of this land. The early years are devastating for the Aboriginal people who live around Sydney Cove. Killings, incarcerations, forced removal from land, wars, diseases, restrictions of movement, and early attempts at forced assimilation all occur in these early years. With the British presence in Australia established, settlement spread between settlers and Aboriginal people. The century was devastating for the Indigenous Australians. When the British arrived, there were between 300,000 and 1 million Indigenous people throughout Australia. At least 3 out of 4 Indigenous Australians did not survive colonization. 1835, attempts to make a treaty. In 1835, John Batman's Treaty was established for the purchase of land around Port Phillip. However, Governor Bourke no longer recognizes this treaty. 1900 to 1970, the stolen generation. By the early 1900s, laws are taken up in all states, giving governments total control over the lives of Indigenous Australians, dictating where they could live and be employed. It also makes all children of Aboriginal peoples wards of the state, meaning they can be removed without permission. Between the two world wars, it is determined that children with non-Indigenous ancestry should be taken from their families and raised in white institutions. This approach leads to the forced removal of children, what is known as the stolen generation. During this time, Aboriginal missions are established by a number of churches. 1948, counted as Australian citizens. In 1948, the Commonwealth Citizenship and Nationality Act gives the category of Australian citizenship to all Australians, including Aboriginal peoples, for the first time ever. However, at a state government level, Aboriginal people still suffer from discrimination. The impacts of this history and events of the past are very important to Aboriginal people of Australia. These events weren't that long ago. There are many people alive today who were forcibly removed from their parents under government policy, had their children taken away, were not allowed in town after 6 at night, were not allowed to be in certain areas without permission, were barred from schools and hospitals, returned from wars only to find that they did not have the same rights as white people, have not enjoyed the same rights as others simply because they are Indigenous. Aborigines today. Aborigines people make up 2% of the population of Australia, and although things are improving, there are still glaring inequalities between the races. For the Aborigines who live in the major cities of Australia, alcoholism and violence are a way of life. Most Aborigines are very poor and of a very low standard of living. Aboriginal elders are attempting to change violent tendencies by taking children to one of many sacred sites and teaching them the ancient ways of their people. The educational system, which was once segregated, is now open to Aboriginal children who are encouraged to attend. However, many Aboriginal children drop out at a young age. The Aborigines who continue to live in rural areas of Australia have tried to keep as much of their tradition and history alive as they can. Many of these traditional Aborigines are also trying to spread their history to members of their race who seem to have lost it. They have teachers and trained students in traditional Aboriginal languages. Even a few radio and TV stations feature only Aboriginal programming to educate the generations that have no prior experience with their culture. Aborigines create many works of art and sell them around the world. Aboriginal art comes in many media: paintings, beadwork, woodwork, bark paintings, and baskets. Aborigines also make and sell the most famous items to come out of Australia, like the boomerang. But some art can't be sold. It's on the walls of caves like the famous Australian landmark, Ayers Rock. Their art is world famous, and many Aborigines make a living off of selling their pieces. Here are some examples of the art that Aborigines people make. Current issues within the Australian justice system. The following speaks toward the underlying issues relevant to explaining the overrepresentation of Australian Aboriginal people in the criminal justice system: socioeconomic disadvantage, racism and segregation, disconnect between Indigenous and non-Indigenous worlds, lack of self-determination, absence and adequate support systems, problems with the government, and these are just a few. It is important that we understand the legacy of Australia's history, as it helps to explain the deep sense of injustice felt by the Aboriginal people, their disadvantaged status, and their attitudes towards non-Aboriginal people in society. The Australian history is the most important underlying issue that assists us to understand the unequal detention rates of Aboriginal people. Contributing factors. The substantial factors related to the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the criminal justice system of Australia include offending patterns, impact of policing, legislation, particularly the impact of laws giving rise to indirect discrimination, factors in legal decision making, for example, bail conditions and absence of sentencing options, cultural differences, role of Aboriginal English, child rearing practices, and vulnerability during police questioning, impact of past policies, forced removal of children, the creation of missions and mass displacement, marginalization, drug and alcohol and other substance abuse, family and community separation, and lastly, socioeconomic factors like unemployment and limited employment opportunities, health issues, housing, lack of education and training opportunities. Background to imprisonment. The two factors considered towards the background and history of imprisonment of Indigenous people in Australia is the following. First, individual factors: effects of colonization, social determinants of health, housing, education, employment, and poverty, etc., mental health and disabilities, and other risk factors. Next, structural factors: laws and policies, policing, sentencing, bail laws and conditions, access to health and support services, availability of diversion options. Similarities between Aboriginal Canadians and Australians. Aboriginal disadvantage in Canada mirrors that of Indigenous people in Australia because both are survivors of colonism. Aboriginal people in Canada were facing a record high of their children being placed in the child welfare system and a huge overrepresentation in the criminal justice system. The same issues that face Australia right now. The statistics were almost identical. Aboriginal people make up 4% of the Canadian population and 25% of its prison population. In Australia, the 3% of the population who identify as Aboriginal make up 27% of those in prison. In both countries, the trauma of colonization was compounded by a government policy of taking children away. Australia's stolen generation saw an estimated 10,500 children forcibly removed and placed on missions to be trained as domestic servants between the late 1800s and the 1970s. In roughly the same period, 150,000 Canadian Aboriginal children were placed in residential schools. The colonization that happened in both countries plays a huge factor in the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the justice system. Improving culturally responsive services to Aboriginal people in custody and access to healthcare on return to community can help reduce the overrepresentation we see in Canada and Australia's justice system. The need for government to work more closely with Aboriginal people to break the cycle of crime is crucial if society wants to see a change. In conclusion, I ask myself, where do we as a society go from here? Society must begin to utilize the evidence to inform policy and program development and to seek enhanced funding and services. Use their government to work more closely with Aboriginal people to break the cycle of crime, disadvantage, and poor health. Improve culturally responsive services to Aboriginal people in custody and access to healthcare on return to community. There is no road to self-determination. Self-determination is the road. Thank you.